Our next speaker is Andrew Whitlock. Andrew did an Ag Science honours degree at Melbourne Uni. He then began his career with DPI in Victoria as a statewide precision agricultural agronomist. This role included 8 months soil-related PA pastoral research at Tatura and other various places. Andrew is also heavily involved with the development of the Victorian CORS network, which now delivers 20mm accurate auto-steer correction signals for throughout Victoria. Andrew's passion for Australian agriculture and commitment to developing precision ag was recognised by the Australian Society of Agronomy as the inaugural Young Agronomist of the Year. Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation today. Over the next 30 minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about our approach to precision ag. So it's very much focused on cropping systems. However, most of our clients are mixed farmers, so we do see plenty of crossover in pasture systems. It's not just about toys for the sake of it, but I suppose we aim to try and understand new technology and see how it fits into the farming systems, and I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of those things on the slide, and I'd actually still say that the most important tool in that entire page, I still believe, would be the humble shovel. So precision ag, it's aiming to deliver a knowledge bank, but instead of it being in a range of different people's head and going back in generations, the level of knowledge increases, as we know. It's about trying to digitise that and download that and get it into some sort of platform that can be contained and analysed for future generations. It's about being more efficient on farm, and then there's always the story of the site-specific nature of precision ag, trying to apply the right amount to the right area. So it's about economics, gross margins, and there's obviously a strong environmental benefit in going down this path. So the first step of precision ag we see is you need to understand your production and understand how that varies across your farm. So you need to get some sort of map of production variability. Yield maps are certainly the most valuable. If you haven't got yield data and collecting that off the harvester, then you can go and get biomass maps through satellite imagery, and you can go back many years and get maps over your farm. I know it's not the same, and we've got to be careful that biomass isn't, we're not making the assumption that biomass is yield, but I think there is, in all the work we've done over the past 10 years, we've got a strong belief that biomass does represent yield potential, and there's just seasonal finishes that might vary that, but it's a good handle on determining zones and variability. But above all that, local knowledge is king, and so the farmer's understanding of paddocks, and so whenever we're mapping variability, we'll have some sort of maps, but we get the farmer to always draw the final zones to identify where that production is occurring. And the first step you have to ask yourself is, do I even need to worry about the variability across my farm? And perhaps it's not an issue, it's not variable enough, it's not in big enough zones to worry about, so blanket management's okay. So it's not always about having to go to vary rate. If we're still unclear as to why the zones are performing the way they are and how to define where those different zones would be, we would then start looking for other data sets with elevation or some soil maps, so EM38 maps you may have heard of, or gamma radiometric surveys. So we very much focus on, we want to know production before we start going down the path of looking at other data sets. And a lot of those those production maps are very low cost, and in many cases the farmers have got them themselves anyway. It's in your head and it's off the harvester. We like to put production in terms of profit. So I think it's really powerful when you first start analysing your farm and looking at production variability, put it in gross margin terms. And it's very easy to do that. Yield maps are essentially a spreadsheet. And if you know your cost of production and the price of grain, you can calculate out an extra layer, extra column. And so I can convert this lupin yield map of 1.1 to 3.5. So, you know, the 1.1, it's still a reasonable crop of lupins. But if I look at the gross margin, I'm actually losing $16 a hectare down there. And I've got up to $600 a hectare positive in the high yielding area. So when you put it in dollar terms, it actually might stimulate a need to actually look at this further. When you've got multiple yield maps, and so this is the beauty of where we've got at least 3 years worth of data, we can start producing yield stability maps. So this is a whole farm map for a farm near Grenfell, and this is a normalised mean. So we take every map, we clean out the data, convert it from tonnes per hectare into percentage above and below the mean, and then we average that over that time. So this map's actually about a 5-year composite, and that's just continually averaged as new data sets become available. So you can see there, the highest area is 170% of the mean. Lowest is 0 over the mean, but it's more like 20% of the mean in those areas. So that's just the base mean. Then we can start saying, well, that's fine, but is it stable or unstable? So are there areas in that farm that are high one year and low another? And so that's the stability map that you can see there. And most of it's fairly stable, but there are areas that flip-flop from year to year. And so that's a message in itself, and trying to understand agronomically why those soil types are performing like that. And perhaps that leads to initially think it's a soil water holding issue. And then the final map is converting that into, say, 3 zones and starting to split that farm up into 3 different categories of above average and below average and spot on average. And then so getting that into the hands of the farmer and the agronomist to start using that to understand what's causing that. If you haven't got the yield data, then as I said, you can go down the track of satellite imagery, and this is 30 metre pixel, so it's Landsat imagery for those who are familiar. And so we typically go back about 10 years and get a map every year. So NDVI is a vegetation index or biomass, blue is high biomass and red is low. And you can see this is a farmer in the Mallee, Victorian Mallee. It does lend itself to larger paddock sizes. I'm based in Ballarat, Victoria, and a lot of our 30, 40, 50 hectare paddocks are possibly too small. A lot of these paddocks here are 100 to 200 hectare plus. And so when you zoom in, the level of variability is captured quite well on the 30 metre pixel. But you get the feeling, you can see there, so we get an individual map, so you can see a 2009 map, and then this is a mean of 04 to 2010. And so getting that into the hands of the farmers, getting them to physically draw zones over the top of that, discuss each paddock, flick through the different years, to then digitise it and then go and do our soil testing. I mentioned local knowledge, and I believe that's absolutely critical. We can produce these nice maps. We still ultimately want to put that on the kitchen table, and in many cases it's using a pen or a texter and drawing out these zones. And you can see here I've got a normalised mean yield over several years worth of yield maps, and then I've given those black lines represent where the farmer has drawn, where they know the production to occur. It's interesting when I compare that to an EM38 map, and many people say that that's the core map for doing variable rate. I think we've got to be really careful not to just believe and trust one data set. I think that the ability of the farmer to tie it all together needs to be considered the most important thing. And you can see here, if we were to go down the path of, and this is in the Mallee where they have done a lot of EM work and trust EM zones, we'd have a very different management strategy if we were to do it just off that EM data set. So we just need to be careful, and we need to make sure local knowledge is absolutely king. So once we've defined our zones, we now need to understand, well, what are the constraints in those different parts of the paddocks. So it's about sitting down, working through the issues with your advisors, and we want to take those production zone maps out into the paddock and do some testing. So we're talking about GPS, and again, comment about the technology being in your phone is absolutely true. A lot of our clients are using their smartphones and loading the maps up, and away they go, and collecting these particularly segmented cores. I think you need to understand more than just what's in 0 to 10. You need to understand right down through that profile, nutrient load through the profile, soil characteristics, ultimately water holding capacity if we can, and if there's any subsoil constraints. This is an example of a paddock where we've got several years worth of yield data. So red is low yield and green is high yield. You can see there though, across those 4 years, we've got fairly similar trends. We throw in 2 other years, which were quite wet, where you can see it's the complete opposite. And so I suppose this highlights the need to be very careful of just using 1 year's worth of data. We need to understand how areas perform over different seasonal conditions. And so on this particular paddock, the definition of the zones is the same. And when we add possibly the missing piece, the farmer's got auto steer, so we can produce an accurate elevation map from his data. We can see that's an elevation map, and the red is the low part of the paddock. So The low, very flat, it's a heavier clay through there. And in the dry years, we've got our highest yield, and this was last year's yield, which was to the absolute T of the elevation. We can clearly define zones, and I don't think this poses the problem that precision ag can't work. It just means we need to understand that we've got seasonal variability, and we just need to try and better understand how those zones are going to perform under a range of different seasons. Another example of a farmer, so that farmer was Streatham or Lake Bolac in southwest Victoria, and this farmer is closer to Geelong. Same story, and you can see the growing season rainfall. Once we got to that high rainfall year, that lower area, which again, if I put the contour map up, it would show the same story. So I don't think we need to be concerned that this flip-flop is the issue. We need to get in there and understand, well, why is it performing? Why is it high in some years and low in others? And in this paddock, we just did some deep soil cores, and there were fundamentally completely different soil profiles there. So this low-yielding area, in the majority of the years, has a very deep soil, very deep topsoil, but we've got a very hostile subsoil. Whereas down in this high-yielding area on every year, except when it gets waterlogged, with much heavier clay, very shallow topsoil, but a very well-structured subsoil. And so, you can graph that against yield, and we've got quite good relationships. So you're not necessarily going to go and do that sort of work on every single paddock, but it's about trying to apply some strategic sampling and to better understand, well, what's happening here. So now we've gone through that part, we want to start developing a bit of a management strategy across the farm, and that's where we start saying, well, we want to correct limitations if it's cost effective. Now that might not always be variable rate. In many cases, you see plenty of opportunities of just using precision ag as getting more information on your farm to make better farm decisions, and it might be irrelevant of variable rate at all, just blanket management strategies, which I'll touch on in a moment. So it's about understanding where the yield potential is for each of the different zones, and if you can't fix it, and you have to accept that there is a serious yield constraint that can't be corrected economically, then it's about managing gross margins and yes, reducing your spend in that area to understand that, well, perhaps I'm never going to get more than 3 tonne in a good year. And then finally, we need to test that strategy with on-farm trials, which I'll talk about. So this is an example. We've got the zone, this is the satellite imagery biomass map. We've got the zones drawn by the farmer on the left-hand side. A little bit difficult to see, but they've described their zones under soil type, so sand and flats and heavy flats. They've done a soil test, and the agronomists send us through a spreadsheet, and we produce a prescription map which goes into the controller, and away they go. Think before, and so that's a nice way to go about it, but there's often many steps we need to do before we actually get to that path and confidently implement a variable rate strategy. So it's about getting these fundamentals right, and I see things like pH, drainage, and soil ameliorants as being, well, pH and manures and gypsum as being really, really important things to get a lift over your entire country, because then your production might change and you might have to reset your goals. Our approach to precision ag, from a lime point of view, is to do regular sampling. So on a 1 hectare grid, we take with our pH probe on the back of this bike here, we sample pH at a depth of 3 inches. It measures, there is limitations with the technology, but it's about identifying zones of pH, and then once we've got our zones, as you can see in this paddock here, we then define those areas and go and do composite samples of a 0 to 10 to send away to a lab and get a full comprehensive test on pH in calc chloride and water and cation exchange capacity, exchangeable aluminium, and to be able to make an accurate lime recommendation. Surface water management is another one, and even in the dry environments we still see waterlogging effects, and when we overlay contour maps they often have very strong correlations with production. And again, this stuff can be done through farmers' information. If you've got auto steer, 2 centimetre auto steer, you can create a contour map. And so it's about trying to integrate that with some production data, yield or satellite imagery, and measure and quantify the area of the paddock, how much of that paddock has been affected by surface water. Is it worthwhile fixing? If it is, let's use some maps to accurately identify where drains to go. In some cases, it's not even drains. It might even be just your change of layout. You might for some reason be running across the contours. Your AB line might be off this southern fence, and if you flip it around, running off the north-south fence, you're going to get better drainage and force that water down So just change of layout can make a huge difference as well. Management effects here. So this is another example of a farmer. They made their management decision pretty much just off this map and local knowledge. They knew, so this is the satellite imagery. We've got these red and yellow areas of low biomass, and he knew straight away that it's cut and fill. This is an irrigation farm. And so off that, we were able to convert that into a two-zone map, load that up onto the John Deere screen. He could go out there and he's implemented gypsum, manure and deep ripping just in those cut areas, and he's equalled the yield for the first time ever last year. So that's why I think it's important to address these fundamentals first, because you actually may change the way, and then the yield maps before that are now no longer relevant. It needs to move forward from that major change. On-farm trials. I think trials are a massively underrated part of precision ag for farms, and we see a lot of our clients doing multiple trials every year and just evolving their agronomy because of that information. Basically, it's about getting the data, so getting something like a yield map, identifying the zones. So we've split that up in, so it's gone from yield data into stability map, define the zones, go out and do the soil testing, develop the strategy, and then test that strategy through some strips, which are going to be running through those different zones, and then analysing the data and looking at gross margins and responses to these different strategies that you've got in place. So it may be a 2 or 3 year process before you actually start implementing any vari-rate, until you've got this research data to know that, sure, there is a positive nitrogen response on the sandy loam, but for that season and that clay, there certainly wasn't. And if you are recording all this data with the GPS technology, it's simple. And so you've got all these coverage maps. So you can see here, chicken manure coverage map in 2009, all these blue strips. The lime in 2008, where that's been applied. And now for every yield map from there on, we've got these layers in the program. We can just grab the yield data out and do an analysis and see how long that effect's being lasted and making decisions. So I think on-farm trials, is something, if you could take one message home today, I'd encourage you to start doing more of that and using precision ag tools to monitor the response. We know seasons vary, of course, and so we see a role for using satellite imagery throughout the year and getting a series of maps through the year to understand how the season's evolving. So early season maps, mid-July time, we can start pulling out crop establishment maps and understanding early weed pressure. So we can map that out. In mid-season, so we're talking about early tillering biomass. If the early nutrition that's gone out, any trials that have been put out, you can start looking at that. And then in the late season, where I see the real application for vari-rate, might be putting on your final nutrient. So you may be putting on a base rate, or you might be putting out, in our part of the world, we would top dress 2 or 3 times of urea or UAN, and we'd be looking at our final applications to be our variable rate application. Up until then, we'd be putting blanket rates out of lower rates, regular feeds, and then we can use these 2 growth rate maps to understand where we're getting the response in the paddock and where we aren't to that nitrogen, to then determine a vari-rate approach. It's also good for trials. So if you know you're going to be going down into a program of regular monitoring, having fertiliser strips, seed rates, whatever the trials are, you can monitor that through the year and understand how that crop has responded, and then ultimately get your final yield to look at the economics of it. So I suppose tying that in, we've got this concept of forensic agronomy, and so we want to start pulling all that information together that I've spoken about, analysing that data, developing these production zones and designing trial programs, on-farm trial programs, getting these in-season images and getting final mapping yield, and then reviewing that entire season, on-farm trials, harvest index relationships, to ultimately utilise that information. We see a real gap in the market for not trying to tie all that information together and assist agronomists and farmers to utilise the data to its full effect. So satellite imagery, this is an example of a paddock, and it's just a snapshot in time. It's there again. We've got to be careful not to make it anything more than it is. It's just a snapshot on that particular day of how your farm's looking. And so on this particular image, we've got blue is high biomass and red is low. And so you can see some waterlogging effects, some strips through here, which actually happen to be some cultivation strips. There was potentially going to be some small-scale plot trials there, which were pulled out. And then also this striping up and down, which was the harvester not spreading effectively the season before. So it's enormous information, and we believe it's highly valuable. 30-metre pixel is the one I spoke about earlier, where you can get 10 years worth of imagery. It's fairly pixelated, so 30 metres by 30 metres is the smallest unit on that map. There's a 5-metre pixel that we commonly use as well, and the beauty of the 5-metre is there's actually 5 satellites in constellation, so there's one of these coming over your farm every single day, so there's potential for daily image capture, which is important in winter because cloud does affect image capture. And then you can go right down to 0.8 or 50 centimetre pixel. So there's a range of different satellites out there, and you use the different satellites for different purposes. Tying it all together, again, this is just an example of the sort of maps that we can start getting and overlaying and pulling and trying to understand. And you can see, so we've got crop biomass in September 2010 with the contour map over the top. And then we can see the final yield, which is fairly similar, and then the elevation map. And you can see where we did the strategic sample points. A little bit difficult to see, but there's some all GPS reference sample points in there. And actually, this farmer for the first time realised he had a potash deficiency or a potassium deficiency on his farm, and we put some, haven't got the results here today, but some potash strips out and identified the response, particularly on this part of this half of the paddock almost, so that's a paddock history effect. Another example of biomass and yield maps looking relatively similar. Well, it's interesting here, there's a faint line sort of through there that you can just see. This is the lowest biomass. This was September last year, August, September last year. The lowest biomass was through this region here. And when we look at the yield map, it was actually more here where our lowest yield map is. So we need to better understand that harvest index relationship, sit down with that farmer and try and find out, well, what has happened in this area that even though it wasn't the smallest biomass, it was at the lowest yield. So it's about using the information and digging into it to better understand what's happening. Again, insects, we've done a lot of work with IPM, and if you start mapping this stuff and mapping out pest issues, you find that they actually occur in the same areas year in, year out, and so there's opportunities for an IPM point of view. This is the earwig damage down near Geelong. Thank you. This is a crop biomass map. So on the motorbike, we drove across the paddock, and the farmer was there when I mapped it, and I said I produced the maps straight away on the computer out in the paddock, and I said, oh, there was a line where I could see an old fence line. He said, no, the fence line was there. That's quite confusing. And he'd actually just sprayed that paddock, and I said, could you see any visual response from the cab? And he said, no, he couldn't really. You could see these are the passes where we'd driven on the motorbike every 18 metres. And so he couldn't really see it by eye. The untrained eye couldn't see it. Once he saw the map and we walked back through it, yes, you could notice it. But from the cab, he actually couldn't notice it, which was quite interesting. We went in and did some tissue tests, and the only thing he could think of was that they had pig manure in 2006, 3 years earlier. And there was the nitrates in that tissue test, and it's the only thing he could think of that was changing that. So the final yield looked very similar as well that year. So we had this highest yield through here. So it's just about trying to use that information, do GPS reference sampling to understand, well, what's happening in there, and then the challenge now is to develop a strategy. What does that farmer do moving forward? Advanced crop scouting, I see a real potential for this, and it's taking off now. All agronomists having smartphones and iPads and loading up their clients' yield data and management zones and doing GPS reference sampling, as we've already heard about today. So this app here is free. $900, get you an iPad or just use your phone, and away you go. So it doesn't have to be expensive. You can also look at mapping weeds. That early season imagery I spoke about. We've got clients mapping weeds and changing management strategies, increasing seeding rates, and using different chemical rates in those different areas. And I actually did some work with Precision Ag Association and Ground Truth that it's a bit tricky to see, but the farmer had drawn some areas just off his head where these different ryegrass patches were through here, and then I actually went out and counted ryegrass tillers and produced a ryegrass map, and it was fairly similar to what he thought. And often these patches are quite stable as well, so I think we can start using this early season imagery for understanding your weed pressure, also assessing management. So this is the spreader, and we see this all the time, spreader not spreading effectively. This is 5 megapixel satellite imagery. Each one of these strips through here is a pass of the spreader, so this is 27 metres. Sorry, no, it's 36 metre spreader. And when we zoom in, you can see that he's not spreading enough directly behind the spreader. It's all going out the side. And so I did some single row harvest work and found that there was about a 13% yield decrease in the middle where that urea wasn't reaching. So, it's a good tool for understanding machinery limitations as well. So as I said at the start, I think it's precision ag is about this level of having multiple layers of information, building that knowledge bank, making more informed decisions and rather than just using gut feel. And there's this concept that people are talking about is this sort of smart farming. So it's information rich, and it's about offering flexibility within season, not just locking into a rigid program. So that's where we need that in-season calibration work. And I'll finish by saying I believe there's lots of low-hanging fruit out there to increase productivity on farms, and we see it all the time. So it doesn't have to be high-cost sort of stuff. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of our approach to managing information and using PA on your farm.
Nigel, is that GPS and satellite imagery biomass applicable to pastures? Could you be monitoring pastures and your dry matter per hectare on a year-round basis with that technology?
Yes, it is applicable to pastures. Dry matter, we've got to be careful to convert it directly into dry matter per hectare. There's some work being done, you might have heard of, pastures from space. That's been developed in Western Australia, and so for their composition of pastures, it makes sense, and they can predict and they can produce. They've got models and they can produce feed on offer, and they, I believe MLA are doing some work on ground truthing that for Eastern Australia. So it's really just an index of high to low. We've got to be a little bit careful to say that's definitely going to equal, so many tonne of dry matter, but it certainly can be used as a relative map in pastures as it can in cropping as well.